A billionaire assumed he was merely being courteous when he invited his maid's mother to a friendly game of chess. He never imagined he would face embarrassment not once but twice, and gain more insight about life in a single afternoon than he had in many years. Grace Bennett always traveled light with only one weekend bag. She carried the same black leather purse for 2 decades and kept a folded newspaper crossword tucked inside the side pocket. Grace disliked overstaying her welcome, especially in someone else's environment. The Amtrak from New York to Old Saybrook was peaceful that Saturday morning, exactly how she preferred it. She watched the trees blur by, sipping coffee from a well-used thermos and turning the pages of an old detective novel. Her daughter Lauren had requested her visit for weeks. Grace had insisted she was fine at home, but fine often masked loneliness. The quietness of her apartment had started to feel suffocating, so finally she agreed. Lauren greeted her at the station with a hug so warm that Grace could no longer pretend she didn't miss her. During the drive, they spoke about everything and nothing. How traffic on Interstate 95 had been manageable, how their neighbor's son was caught sneaking into a backyard pool, and how her knees were acting up, though she still refused medical advice. The estate appeared just as Grace mentioned her church's bingo night getting canceled. Stopping mid-sentence, she said, "You never told me this place was like this." Lauren chuckled softly, eyes fixed on the lengthy driveway ahead. Bordered by neatly trimmed hedges and clusters of white hydrangeas, Grace did not think it made a difference. The residence was enormous yet understated, built of brick and covered in ivy, featuring tall windows and sturdy white columns. It appeared to be the type of home where whispers replaced conversations and where you wiped your shoes twice, even if they were already spotless. Inside, everything carried a subtle scent of lemon polish and aged paper. This was the kind of cleanliness imposed by someone else's hands. Grace stood silently while Lauren moved about busily, announcing the household rules. No shoes were allowed on the Persian rug. The antique mirror in the hallway was off limits, and questions about the locked room upstairs were forbidden since he was not home at the moment. Lauren added, "If he does come in, just be courteous, say hello, but do not be concerned. He keeps to himself." Grace nodded, thinking politeness had never been an issue for her as she placed her bag next to the kitchen door and strolled into the sunroom. She was drawn by the sunlight streaming across the tiled floor, where she noticed the chessboard. Crafted from dark walnut with ivory-colored squares and intricately carved pieces that appeared hand-polished and weighty, a game was already underway. White's queen was in mid-attack. Grace tilted her head. The position seemed poor. Someone had left their defenses completely exposed. "Do you play?" The voice came from behind her, calm, smooth, and clear, as if there was no need to raise volume to be heard. She turned to see a tall man dressed in a cream sweater and neatly pressed trousers. Charles Davidson looked exactly like the house he inhabited. Grace appeared elegant, cold, and a little too flawless around the edges, she had once said. He glanced at the chessboard, then back at her, offering a challenge. "Care for a match?" Grace smirked in response. "Sure, why not?" At that moment, Lauren entered carrying a tray with neatly folded linens and almost dropped it. "Mr. Davidson," she began, but he waved her off dismissively. "It is only a game, Lauren." Grace settled into the chair with ease, thinking, that is what everyone says, but this will be more than just a game. None of them realized it yet. The chair surprised her with its comfort. Not soft, since it was quite upright, but firm in a way that spoke of luxury. She adjusted her sleeves, eyed the pieces, and waited. Charles sat across from her, fingers poised delicately on the white bishop as if it were a priceless museum object. He examined the board before meeting her gaze, assessing something in her expression. "I will play white," he said, more as a declaration than a question. Grace did not hesitate. "Go ahead." Lauren lingered nearby, uncertain whether to remain or slip away. Charles was usually so reserved and unpredictable even at his finest moments. Watching her mother opposite him at that gleaming table felt like observing a glassware balancing precariously on the edge of a counter. Steady, but for how much longer? Charles moved the first pawn to e4. "A customary opening," Grace muttered under her breath, mostly to herself. "Do you have a favorite playing style?" he inquired, eyes still fixed on the board. "I prefer to understand what I am facing before labeling it a style." Charles gave a faint smile. Not mocking, but amused perhaps, then swiftly moved another piece. His play was precise and deliberate. Grace countered calmly with her bishop, followed by her knight. She avoided rushing. She had witnessed too many players hurry to impress, only to fall apart by the 10th move. Charles leaned back and observed calmly. You seem relaxed. It wouldn't make sense to play in anger. Another move. A thoughtful pause. You know, Charles said, my father started teaching me chess when I was 8. He believed it would instill discipline, control, and foresight. Did it? Grace inquired. No, he answered, but I became skilled enough to win several country club contests. She smiled knowingly. Have you ever played at Wickwahik Park in Newark? He continued. That is where I learned. Boys from all over town gathered there, bringing plastic boards and milk crates to sit on. I lost my first 10 games, then I stopped losing. Charles moved a piece with care, then hesitated, adding, You are better than I expected. That's because you were thinking. He raised an eyebrow at her. Grace's tone softened. You saw me come in, an older woman, a bit slow on my knees, wearing a cardigan over a church dress, and figured I'd entertain you for a few moves before sending me back to the kitchen. Charles blinked once, stunned. Is that really what you think of me? No, she replied. That is what you think of me. The room was silent, holding its breath. Then Charles let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. Fair enough. From the hallway, Lauren peeked inside, lips tight, prepared to intervene if needed. But the chessboard remained between them, the game still unfolding. Charles adjusted his queen with quiet focus. You are astute, Mrs. Bennet. It is just grace, and sharpness does not depend on age. The pace quickened. Charles moved more swiftly, attempting to disrupt her rhythm. Grace remained calm and steady. She anticipated his traps before they were fully set. He tried to corner her using a rook and queen, but she evaded with a knight, overturning his entire formation. Puzzled, he rubbed his chin. This is humiliating. She tilted her head. No. This is chess, move after move. Charles began breathing heavily through his nose. Grace's pieces were gradually dominating the board methodically and cleanly, like wiping a surface square by square. His bishop had vanished and his right rook was trapped. She sacrificed a pawn to lure his king, and it succeeded. It takes more than money and books to truly read the board, she murmured softly. Like a teacher quietly correcting a pupil, he leaned back with a furrowed brow and tense lips. Check, she declared. He exhaled. I understand one more move. Checkmate. Charles blinked twice, staring at the board as if he had miscalculated, but it was correct. His king had no escape. Lauren exhaled without realizing she was holding her breath. Charles shook his head slowly. Impressive. Grace folded her hands on her lap. That is what happens when you have been playing the long game your entire life, he laughed sincerely. This time. Would you stay for a rematch after lunch? I have time. She replied, gazing out at the garden beyond the window. You may. But it was not only time that was changing. In that home, respect had settled into the space and showed no signs of leaving. The lunch was subdued, almost uncomfortable. Charles served roasted chicken, asparagus, and wild rice, neatly arranged by the private chef who barely caught anyone's gaze. Lauren stayed mostly silent, watching her mother handle a cloth napkin as if she were at a church banquet. Grace was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply hungry. Charles, however, kept stealing glances at her, not in a rude way, but with curiosity, as if he was still figuring out how someone like her could have just wiped the slate clean. I have never lost that quickly, he eventually admitted, stabbing a piece of asparagus with more force than needed. Grace lifted one eyebrow. You will again if you keep playing the same way. Lauren almost choked on her water. Charles caught her eye and smiled. Not the stiff, polite smile he usually reserved for guests, but a looser one. You enjoy speaking the truth, don't you? Not all the time, she answered. But when someone asks for it, I believe they deserve it. He nodded thoughtfully, then shifted his focus to the garden view. This place belonged to my grandfather. He believed if a man wasn't good at chess, he wasn't good at life. Grace wiped her mouth's corner. Many men confuse control with wisdom. Those words lingered in the air long enough that even the birds outside seemed quieter. After lunch, they retreated to the sunroom where the board had been freshly reset. Charles rolled his sleeves up slightly while Grace settled just as comfortably as before. She moved with such confidence as if she truly belonged there, which, in a sense, she did. "Now I will play black this round," he said. "Suit yourself," she replied. The initial moves went swiftly. Pawn, knight, bishop, nothing unusual. Charles was now entirely focused, trying to shake off the shock that had unsettled him in their first game. He observed her hands carefully, tracked her gaze, second-guessing every piece she touched. "You're studying me," Grace said without looking up, attempting to decipher his pattern. She placed her knight and glanced at him. "Chess is not jazz. You don't read rhythm." "You read patience," he growled. "That's what I'm missing." By the 15th move, Charles had captured one of her rooks, but the price was steep. His center was exposed, and Grace was silently advancing her pawns like soldiers executing a plan. Lauren, standing near the kitchen entrance, leaned toward the butler and whispered, "He's pushing too hard." The butler remained quiet, but equally attentive. Charles tried to trap her queen by advancing both bishops into a daring setup. Grace took her time, picked up a pawn, rolled it between her fingers, then firmly set it down. The entire left flank of the board was under her control at this point. "Have you ever competed?" Charles asked, clearly trying to buy time. Grace shook her head. "No time, with kids and bills. But I used to play 3 games simultaneously in the park, on folding chairs. Win one, draw one, make the last one cry." He chuckled briefly, but the humor vanished quickly. Her dominance was growing, his options dwindling rapidly, and he admitted in his heart, "I don't like this." He asked what losing again meant. Grace met his glance. "It is only a game, remember." He looked at her briefly, then gave a slow nod. But by then, everything was decided. Within 3 more moves, his king was trapped once more, not encircled with style, but pinned in a way that seemed deeply personal. "Silent, inevitable checkmate," she stated. Charles leaned back, and this time no denial came. No searching for an overlooked move, he just remained still, the corners of his lips curling faintly upward. "You are quite something, Grace." She rose slowly, stretching her back. "I am merely someone who plans ahead." Yet Charles was not simply losing in chess. He was starting to lose the reality he had carefully constructed around himself. When Charles set the board again, the sun had shifted, and the golden light streamed through the windows, spilling across the floor at an angle, casting long shadows over the squares. Grace did not hurry, though she remained calm, smoothing her skirt as she settled back into the chair. "Third time's the charm?" she asked calmly. Charles laughed, but there was a subtle hint of frustration in his eyes. He was not used to being on the defensive, not at work, not in life, and certainly not in his own home. "I have to prove I am not completely hopeless," he said, setting the pieces down harder than needed. "Lauren, bring us some coffee, would you?" Lauren paused. "Of course, sir." As she left the room, her eyes met her mother's. Grace gave her the slightest shake of her head. Just enough to say, "Don't worry, I'm fine this time." Charles Davidson chose a different tactic. He attacked boldly from the start, advancing his pawns aggressively and provoking clashes in the center of the board. Grace adapted calmly, not with anxiety, but with the kind of steady flexibility gained from facing tougher challenges than a bishop's forward move. "Do you ever play speed chess?" he inquired without looking away from the board in the park. "Time is all you have, but that does not mean you should squander it." He attempted to trap her knight, yet she caught his queen's bishop instead. Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You really never quit, do you?" Grace's voice was gentle. "You learn that when life does not offer second chances." Lauren came back holding 2 cups of coffee. Charles did not even glance up. Grace, however, gave her daughter a soft thank you and took a sip, as if it was part of her strategy. Charles moved too hastily, losing a knight. He tried to recover by castling long, but Grace was already pushing her pawns on the opposite side. She was not merely protecting but determining the pace, guiding the entire game to her rhythm. "You are quiet when you play," Charles murmured. "I think or say quietly inside my head." He smiled faintly. "That is a contradiction." "So is being wealthy and bored." He blinked, clearly surprised by the remark. Grace did not smile or wink. She simply positioned a rook precisely where it was needed. "I am not bored," he said after a pause. "No," she answered while sipping her coffee again. "Then why did you ask a stranger to play chess?" The impact was stronger than either of them had anticipated, and silence stretched between them. Charles glanced down at the board. His king was trapped once more, his rook restricted, and his knight ineffective. "You have control of the board," he acknowledged. She met his gaze, no hint of victory in her eyes. "It's not about control. It is about knowing when to act and when to hold back," she responded. Charles stared intently and said, "You could have been a grandmaster." "I could have been many things," she replied. Lauren lingered in the hallway, listening carefully. She had never heard her mother speak like this. Unshielded, unrefined, not concerned with appearances but honest, straightforward, and somehow still kind. "Checkmate, Grace," she said again, quietly. Charles did not object. Instead, he studied the pieces, then slowly reclined in his chair, exhaling deeply. "How did you learn to play like that?" he asked. Grace gazed beyond him as though watching a memory float past the window. "Years ago, my husband worked night shifts. After the children were asleep, I would sit at the kitchen table with an old chess book and a second-hand board from a thrift store, playing both sides until I discovered something new. Sometimes I played through the entire night," she recalled. Charles observed her as if seeing her for the first time. "You did that all alone?" he asked. "Most of it, yes," she answered. He remained still, almost uneasy under the significance of her words. Before they could discuss further, Lauren stepped forward, and her words would change everything. Once again, Lauren stepped forward cautiously, gripping the linen towel she had been nervously twisting between her fingers. "Mr. Davidson," she said carefully, "my mother needs some rest. She has been traveling by train since early this morning and hasn't even properly set down her bag." Grace gave her a look, not harsh but composed and clear. "I'm fine, dear. He just requires someone to challenge him, that is all." Charles rose from the chess table and faced Lauren. "She is right. I do need the challenge," he admitted. His tone was not defensive. Rather, it seemed as if a small part of him was opening up. "I spend too much time around people who tell me I am correct, even when I know I am mistaken." Lauren remained silent, her weariness evident. The exhaustion from juggling her responsibilities at work and caring for her mother, from managing two worlds that were never intended to collide. "I am merely saying," she continued softly, "this is not the sort of place where people are usually invited to play chess and chat over coffee, especially not people like my mother." The words lingered heavily. Charles looked at her, and for the first time, there was no polite distance in his gaze. Perhaps that was the issue. Turning back to Grace, he asked, "Would you consider joining me for lunch tomorrow?" "Just lunch. No chess, unless it strikes your fancy. I would appreciate the company." Grace studied him, not the invitation but the man himself, his stance, his voice, the way he glanced away as if unused to making requests. She did not reply immediately. "Is this about chess?" she finally inquired. "Are you trying to fix something inside yourself?" Charles appeared taken aback by the question but did not shy away from it. "Maybe it is both." Grace nodded slowly without giving a clear yes or no, just absorbing him as if she had endless time. Later that evening, back in the small guest room, Lauren had prepared. Grace sat on the bed's edge and took off her shoes, her feet sore and her hips stiff. However, something about those games had stirred an old forgotten part of her. Lauren entered still in her work shoes and sat down next to her. "Are you sure you are all right?" she asked softly. Grace smiled without meeting her eyes. "I am tired, not gone." They both chuckled, but the sound quickly faded. Lauren hesitated. "I have worked for that man for 4 years, and he has never said more than 10 words to me in a day. Now you arrive. Suddenly he is so talkative and thoughtful it makes me wonder if I am not doing enough, or if perhaps I am not noticed the way you are." Grace turned to hold her daughter's hand. "Sweetheart, the way you carry yourself each day, the things you manage all alone, that man could not handle half of what you do." Lauren blinked back unexpected tears. "It feels strange, Mom, seeing you in his house like that, as if you belong there more than I ever have." Grace leaned back, the mattress creaking softly under her. "I did not belong there. I simply did not ask for permission." The following morning, Charles stood at the foot of the stairs holding 2 cups of coffee, one black and the other with just the perfect touch of milk. Grace blinked as she noticed him, and he said, "I thought you might want to sit outside in the garden today." No distractions, just a bench and some calm. She raised an eyebrow and asked, "Are you following me around now?" He smiled. "Maybe I'm curious about where the next checkmate will come from." What neither anticipated was how that quiet conversation in the garden would start to uncover hidden truths they had both been avoiding. The garden carried a gentle scent of rosemary mixed with fresh grass. It was not silent yet not noisy either. Birds sang softly, a breeze stirred the leaves, and somewhere distant a sprinkler whispered. Charles guided Grace to a wooden bench near a stone fountain, where water moved slowly, as if it had no rush to go anywhere. Grace took her coffee, settled down, and glanced around. "This is a great place to reflect," she said. "That is exactly why I come here," Charles replied, easing onto the opposite side of the bench. "Most people do not know how to handle silence." She took a sip of her drink and responded, "Many are afraid of it." They sat there in quiet for several moments. No awkwardness, no pressure, just stillness. Clearing his throat, Charles admitted, "I have been living alone in this house for almost 7 years now. My wife passed away due to surgical complications. It was meant to be a routine procedure." Grace glanced at him not with sorrow but with true empathy. "I lost my husband to a stroke," she shared. "He was making coffee in the kitchen, dropped the cup, and by the time I arrived, he had already passed away." Charles blinked slowly. That last moment. The wind gently rustled the leaves. The fountain continued flowing. Neither of them rushed to break the silence. "I kept myself occupied after she passed," Charles finally spoke. "I buried myself in managing estates, organizing fundraisers, dealing with people who expected things from me. But there was always a hole, a void I couldn't figure out how to fill." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "Grief is like a locked drawer. You cannot force it open, but you know it exists. You hear it with every creak of the floor." He looked at her as if she had voiced something he had never been able to express. "Have you ever thought about getting married again?" he inquired. Grace laughed softly. "At my age, I just long for peace, comfortable shoes, and maybe a good book now and then." Charles offered a sincere smile. "Fair enough." She shifted slightly toward him. "Do you ever wonder if the version of yourself others see doesn't tell the whole story? For years, I was just Lauren's mother, or the quiet woman who helps out with Sunday school. But I was also someone who played chess on milk crates and corrected lawyers on their openings in the park." He chuckled. "I would pay to see that." "You already have," she teased. He leaned back, gazing at the sky. "You know the strange thing is, you came here just to visit your daughter, yet I feel like you've done so much more for this home." In just 2 days, more had happened than in 2 entire years. Grace looked him straight in the eyes and said, "That is because I am not performing for you." He sat up, narrowing his eyes, not offended, but pensive. "Are you trying to teach me something?" he asked. "Only if you are prepared to learn," she smiled. Both of them grinned from the other side of the garden hedge. Lauren watched from the window, able to see them clearly. Two people who seemed like they should never belong together on paper. Yet here they were, sharing a garden bench like old friends. "You see them," the butler murmured softly behind her. Lauren startled. "Yes, I see them. He has been quieter than usual recently." "That might be good for him," said the butler. Lauren said nothing. Her mind was crowded with thoughts, with nowhere safe to place them. Outside, Charles Davidson motioned towards the chessboard still set up in the sunroom. "Do you think I will ever win against you?" he asked. "Not if you keep playing the person you believe I am," she replied. He nodded slowly, letting her words sink in deeply. They remained there until the sun slipped past the hedges, and the air grew cool enough to remind them the day was fading away. Yet Charles was not the only one transformed by those moments. Lauren found herself grappling with a truth she had yet to speak aloud. By the middle of the week, the house felt different. It was not noisy, nor did anyone say anything outright. But there were looks exchanged, lingering glances, sudden pauses in conversation when Grace entered a room. The kitchen staff, the groundskeepers, even Mrs. Pennington, the estate manager known for her clipped words, began treating Grace with a kind of restrained formality. Politeness appeared sincere, but beneath it lay indifference. Lauren was the first to sense it. It showed in how people smiled at her mother without ever meeting her eyes, in the way conversations became scarce around her. Most noticeably, it was evident in the change of tone when the estate's habitual visitors arrived. On a Thursday afternoon, one such guest, Elise Van Dorn, a family acquaintance whose name was engraved on museum plaques and donor walls, arrived in a silver Jaguar. She wore a perfectly fitted beige suit and a scarf seemingly untouched by even the slightest speck of dust. Charles welcomed her with a gentle hug on the front steps. Grace sat by the window in the sunroom, sipping tea while her gaze rested on the chessboard before her. Lauren quietly dusted the shelves behind her mother, every gesture careful, intentional, and silent. Whispering softly, Lauren asked, "Are you sure about this?" Grace did not glance up and replied calmly, "Sure about what? Being out here in plain view? If I could play in the park with sirens blaring behind me, surely I can sit here calmly wearing a silk scarf and watch the world inside." Charles led Elise into the sitting room. Grace could hear faint laughter and the tapping of high heels on wood floors. Elise remarked just loud enough for the nearby staff to catch, "She's quite the surprise, isn't she?" "Who?" Charles inquired. "Your guest?" Elise answered, "The chess player in pearls, very unconventional." Charles hesitated before admitting, "She's better than I am." Elise smiled and said, "Oh, I'm sure, but I never imagined you would spend your afternoons with a—" Interacting with someone from a completely different background, it was gentle, adorned, and coated in sweetness, yet the edge still managed to wound. Charles did not answer immediately, then he spoke. "Grace possesses more insight than anyone I have shared a meal with in ages. You might gain something if you spent time with her." Alice released a soft chuckle, the type people use when unsure how else to react. Back in the sunroom, Grace glanced at her daughter. "Someone judging me." Lauren's voice was tense. Perhaps Grace turned a pawn in her hand thoughtfully. "Then they are wasting their time. I have lived long enough to understand that judgment does not pay the bills or raise a child, Lauren." She bent down to retrieve a coaster from beneath the table. "You should not have to prove anything." "I am not. I am simply being noticed for once, and some people do not appreciate that." Later that day, walking along the garden path, Charles caught up with Grace. He seemed uneasy in his own home, hands buried in his pockets, unsure of his steps. "Alice did not mean harm," he said after a lengthy pause. "I completely understand what she implied." Grace responded without slowing her pace. Charles exhaled. "I did not know how to reply. You said what you could, that alone matters." He gazed at the grass. "People in my environment have a way of forcing you to choose a side without ever openly stating it." Grace stopped walking, then said, "Perhaps it is time you stop choosing sides and begin standing on your own feet." He regarded her, once again taken aback by her straightforwardness. "I am not a project, Charles," she declared. "I'm not a cause or a test or a passing distraction this afternoon. I am someone who plans 4 steps ahead." She anticipated this moment. Charles Davidson nodded in agreement, acknowledging, "I deserved that." Grace studied him for a moment. "Not everything revolves around whether you deserve it. Sometimes people simply need to hear the truth." Yet the truth often unsettled others, and Grace was about to discover who could genuinely accept it. The dinner was meant to be intimate, involving only a handful of Charles's closest associates, estate supporters, a local judge, Elise Van Dorn, and a man named Dr. Lionel Stratford, who was a retired professor from Yale and a cigar aficionado with a commanding presence. Grace had no plans to join. She told Lauren she preferred the comfort of her room with a book and slippers. Still, Charles insisted with both kindness and firmness. "I want you there," he said that morning. This was not just an ordinary meal. It was something else this time. Grace agreed hesitantly, not because of the company, but out of curiosity to understand what he meant by something else. The dining room was long, featuring a table with space for 20, but holding only 8 that evening. Candlelight danced, cutlery gleamed, and the dishes were arranged like masterpieces. Grace wore a navy blue sweater over her dress. She declined the stylist Charles had suggested earlier, saying, "I clean up well," and indeed she did. The meal began quietly. Charles sat at the head, Grace to his left, Elise on his right, while the others were spaced out like ornaments along the sides. The wine poured, and polite chatter drifted gently until Dr. Stratford was the first to break the calm. "So, Charles," he said with a confident and clear voice, "I have heard the whispers. You have a new secret strategy on the chessboard." Lauren, serving from the sideboard, suddenly froze. Charles grinned. No secret, just someone who outplays me. Strafford glanced at Grace, raising an eyebrow, and asked, "May I inquire where you learned your skills?" Grace did not flinch. "In my kitchen," she replied, "on a 50-cent board from the Goodwill shop." A few smiles around the table tightened uncomfortably. Elise reached for her wine, but Strafford laughed as if he had not caught her gesture. "Surely you have competed somewhere," he said. "Someone with such talent must have been discovered already." Grace held his gaze. "Discovery is an odd concept," she said. "People like you only find what you are already searching for." Charles shifted in his chair as the room seemed to shrink. Strafford tilted his head and tried again. "It is just unusual, that is all. Someone with your background playing at such a high level, truly impressive." The atmosphere shifted, not dramatically, but enough to feel the tension settle, like dust on a glass surface. Grace put down her fork. "My background is 40 years of working, raising children, losing a husband, and maintaining my dignity when others treated me like I was invisible. That is where I come from. Are you impressed by that?" Strafford blinked. "Well, I did not mean—" "Yes, you did," she interrupted sharply. "You meant to say I did not belong at this table, and I am simply informing you that I never asked to be here. I was invited." Elise cleared her throat and said, "Let us not get carried away." Lionel was merely curious, but Charles interrupted with a calm yet firm tone that carried a hint of superiority. Everyone fell silent as Charles turned toward Grace. "I am sorry," he began, but Grace immediately shook her head. "Do not apologize for him. Allow others to reveal their true selves." Strafford pushed his chair back just a bit. "I believe I have overstayed my welcome." "No," Grace responded, rising slowly. "I think I have reached the limit of my patience." She stepped away from the table while Lauren was already by her side, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Are you certain?" Lauren whispered. Grace muttered softly, "I am done providing entertainment without reward." She exited the room calmly, without fuss or slamming doors. It was a quiet strength that unsettled people far more than shouting ever could. Charles remained seated, his gaze fixed on the vacant chair beside him. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the lights were lowered, Charles knocked on the guest room door. Grace opened it halfway. "I did not expect that," he said. "People seldom do," she replied. He hesitated, then confessed, "You were right. I sat there and allowed him to speak that way." "You sat there and learned something," she said. "That is a beginning." Charles bowed his head. "I am not certain I belong in your world either." She smiled and offered, "Perhaps the point is that neither of us needs to ask for permission any longer." But Grace was not simply walking away from a table, she was crafting a new one. And someone unexpected was about to join her. Saturday morning greeted the day with clear skies and the faint scent of morning dew still lingering on the grass. Grace sat alone in the garden, draped in her husband's old windbreaker and worn-out walking shoes. In front of her, a chessboard rested on a small stone table, pieces mid-game, with a white bishop menacing the black rook. She wasn't playing anyone, but was instead exploring different moves and their consequences. The gentle breeze brushed her face pleasantly. Lauren emerged quietly, carrying a tray filled with fruit and toast. She placed it beside her mother and perched on the edge of the bench. "You not going back inside?" she asked. Without looking up, Grace replied, "No, I'm tired of rooms filled with long tables and narrow minds." Lauren gave a slight smile despite her worry. "He hasn't stopped pacing since you left the dinner. He needed that walk just now." Charles Davidson came into the garden, but this time he was not alone. A young girl trailed behind him, about 16, tall, with short braids, and piercing eyes that did not flicker. She wore a hoodie and jeans, her hands buried deep in her pockets. Charles said, "Grace, this is Camille. She's from Bridgeport. Her mother works at the community center, and she has been playing chess online for 2 years, but has never had a mentor." Grace looked at the girl and then at Charles, asking, "What are you suggesting?" He answered, "I want to support something real, not some flashy charity with fancy parties and handshakes. I want you to lead a program here on the estate or nearby. You teach chess strategy, life skills, whatever you see fit, and I will back it." Grace glanced at Camille. The girl looked from the board back to Grace and asked, "Are you any good?" Grace responded with a smile, and Camille shrugged. "I don't lose often." Grace smiled warmly, saying, "That is not the same as being good." Tilting her head slightly, Camille challenged, "Are you going to teach me or not?" Grace glanced up at Charles Davidson and asked, "Why me?" He replied, "Because I have seen what happens when you sit at a table. People change. They either listen or become uneasy. Either way, they grow." Turning back to Camille, Grace asked, "Do you have a ride home, sweetheart?" Camille replied, "My mother is picking me up at 2. Grace then said, "Then sit down. Let's find out what you know." Camille slid into the chair opposite her. Lauren crossed her arms and observed with a slight smile. Charles Davidson stayed a few steps behind, silent but attentive. At first, they played quietly. Camille started with a familiar opening move. Grace was not aiming to win, but wanted to understand how the girl approached the game. She soon noticed Camille's habit of making sacrifices too early, bold, but risky. "You are impatient," Grace said. Camille frowned and replied, "No, I just dislike wasting time." Grace smiled. "That is the same thing." They played again and again. By the third round, Camille stopped trying to impress. She listened more carefully and made adjustments, even asking questions. After an hour, Grace stood slowly, her knees making soft cracking sounds. "You will do wonderfully," she said. "But only if you start seeing this game as a mirror and not a hammer." Camille blinked, puzzled, and asked, "What does that mean?" "Do you want to beat people?" Grace explained. "I want to understand people. That is the difference." Charles Davidson walked over quietly, hands in his pockets. "She is brilliant," he said, nodding towards Camille. Grace saw the potential, then turned to Charles Davidson. "Are you truly committed to this project?" she asked. "I've already reached out to the zoning board. The old library space on Broad Street is available," he replied. "It needs some fixing up," Grace said. "I will take care of that, and you manage the kids." Grace sat back down on the bench. She did not smile. Instead, her gaze shifted from the board to Camille. "What do you get out of this?" Charles paused for a moment. Grace nodded and said, "Just don't micromanage me." "I would never." Lauren stepped forward a few paces. "Mama, are you really doing this?" Grace looked at her daughter, her eyes gentle yet piercing. "I believe I already have." This was more than just launching a program. It was unlocking a door, and Grace held the keys for the next generation waiting just beyond. 3 months later, the old library on Broad Street did not impress much from the outside. The bricks remained chipped in several areas, and the original sign hung unevenly. However, inside, the scene was transformed. The dusty shelves and cracked floor tiles were gone, replaced by warm lighting, sturdy tables, and 20 identical chessboards aligned like disciplined soldiers. Posters decorated the walls, some featuring renowned grandmasters, and others displaying beautifully handwritten slogans such as "Think Ahead," "Think Beyond," and "Think Better." That Monday afternoon, the room teemed with teenagers from Bridgeport, Norwalk, and New Haven. They hunched over the boards, brows furrowed. Some whispered their moves, while others sat silently, lost in deep focus. And in the corner, as always, Grace Bennett sat calmly wearing her gray cardigan, and the very same watch her husband had gifted her 3 decades ago. Her voice remained calm, while her presence conveyed everything she wished to express. Opposite her was Camille, still confident yet noticeably sharper, her moves more calculated and purposeful. She had stopped rushing and instead started carefully crafting her strategies. Grace observed her with quiet admiration. "Do you really believe you can win against me today?" Grace asked. Camille smiled confidently and replied, "I know I can, and that is your first error." They laughed together, but soon the match took a serious turn. Around them, students glanced over, intrigued. Camille earned respect from her peers not by loudness, but through learning and adapting. Charles Davidson visited once every week, never dressed formally, always bringing a box of pastries, and quietly handing a check to Lauren, who now handled the finances and payroll. "You have done more with this place than I ever managed," he said during one visit. Grace, sipping lukewarm tea from a chipped cup, responded softly, "That is because you were waiting for the right moment. I chose to stop waiting. He nodded in agreement. There is often a line outside these days. The word is spreading about the work here, she continued. The children want someone to appreciate how their minds function, and not just focus on where they came from. Lauren stood in the doorway, smiling quietly to herself. She had made it a habit to come early each morning, checking supplies, organizing schedules, and watching her mother flourish in a way she had never witnessed before. Grace would joke by saying, "I am still the boss of this building, and I am still the one who repairs the printer," Lauren always responded. The space had grown into something beyond just a chess room. It had transformed into a community. Students lingered after matches to share their stories, their challenges, their dreams. One boy named Tristan began composing poems between games, while a girl named Joy helped fix a faulty light fixture, and now aimed to pursue engineering. None of this had been in Grace's initial plan, because she never had one. She simply showed up and continued to show up. One Thursday afternoon, Camille stood at the front of the room holding a small trophy she had just earned by winning a regional competition in Stamford, taking first place. Her mother was at the back, beaming. Grace called for everyone's attention. "Camille is not just a skilled player," she said, her voice steady, yet powerful. "She is someone who pays attention when it counts. That's what leads to victories, and that's what shapes a life." The room burst into applause. Camille wiped her tears with her sleeve and sat back down, speechless for once. Later that night, after the students had left and the lights were dimmed, Grace sat alone at the main table, rearranging the pieces one last time. Charles Davidson approached quietly. "You look exhausted," he said. "I feel proud," she replied. He placed a folder beside her. Inside were documents, foundation status approval, plans for funding and growth, even letters from community leaders. "You have created something, Grace, and people want more of it." She closed the folder and smiled. "Then I will need more chairs." They remained quiet for some time. Two individuals who never imagined their paths would cross yet had ceased trying to understand why. "Have you ever wondered what it truly means to leave a mark?" Charles asked. Grace leaned back and replied, "Only if it is not about the mark itself, but about what grows from it." He smiled and said, "You should write that down." "I just did," she responded, tapping her temple. Outside, the streetlights flickered on while children strolled by with backpacks and takeout boxes. Life continued as usual. Inside that building, however, a new pace had settled in, slow, steady, and intentional, like a game of chess played by someone who understood patience and knew precisely when to make a move. Grace never sought fame. She aimed for impact, and somehow, with a borrowed chessboard and an open door, she had achieved both. If this story resonates with you, share it. Stories like Grace's happen every day. They just do not always reach the places that count. Perhaps you know someone like her, or maybe you are someone like her. Do not wait for an invitation. Take a seat and start playing.